On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex talks with author and well-known atheist John Loftus about his book, The Outsider Test for Faith: How to Know Which Religion is True.
When we falsify the idea that you are this biological robot, and we accept that that's absurd, and once we get past the idea that consciousness ends at death, when I cross that chasm and I say, okay, that's the evidence and I have to deal with it, a lot of things start falling differently in terms of how I orient myself to morals, purpose, meaning in life. You are not a biological robot.
Well, okay, all right, fine. I mean, I disagree, and I've said why. So,
of course, you disagree. You stand up and say, I am a biological robot. I am going to stand by that.
Well, there's no evidence for invisible beings or entities.
Hey, but you, as you live your life like a biological robot.
Everybody does. That's all there is.
Okay.
I don't want to discount your questions. I don't want to. I think that you might be doing a service to atheists. I encourage the exploration of all the ideas.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and this episode of Skeptiko is yet another in this series I've been doing on atheism. Now, I do feel a need to tell you a little bit about how I came to do this interview, because, as you know, if you've listened, you just heard a similar kind of debate with philosophy professor Dr. Stephen Law. And actually, these two interviews with Dr. Law and John Loftus came about as the result of my interview on episode 217 with Gary Marcus. Because Gary Marcus, of course, is this NYU professor of psychology, best-selling author, writes frequently on consciousness issues, yet, if you listen to the interview, stumbled with some basic questions about consciousness. And surprisingly, but I guess not surprisingly for me, because I keep pounding on this drum, is essentially atheistic in his thinking. That is, academia is atheistic. So you go to a guy like Gary Marcus, he's not waving the flag for atheism, but you push through just a little bit and boom, there it is, the same kind of talking points parroted back to you that you hear from atheists. So that led me to saying, I really need to revisit the atheist proposition directly and establish a dialogue with some atheists. So the way that I often do that is I go to Amazon and I look for the best-selling books in the category I'm interested in. In this case, it was atheism. And I came up with Dr. Stephen Law's book, and I also came up with John Loftus's book. So it's kind of a numbers game in inviting guests on. You don't get everyone you ask. So a lot of times I'll go out with a couple of requests and hope to get one. In this case, I got both of them. I got one, and then a week later, John Loftus responded and said, hey, I missed the email, but I'd be happy to do it. So I felt obligated, and I felt like there was enough of a difference between the two that I could pursue both of them, because they really cover two different aspects of the atheism proposition. One is the philosophy of science proposition that you heard from Dr. Stephen Law that I think doesn't hold up very well, and from the discussion we've had, he doesn't really come off as sounding like he has a very strong case, but we'll kind of leave that as it is. And then the second is this religious thrust that you get from John Loftus, whose website is all about debunking Christianity, but as you'll hear in this dialogue, seems to come up short and actually sound somewhat convoluted once you get past some of these silly, empty tomb Christianity kind of debate. And let me add one more thing that I've said in the past, but I think bears repeating. These kind of interviews are among the most important kind of interviews I can do, that I can bring forward. Because I believe the number one thing that holds people back from making their own personal paradigm shift, beyond the silliness of this "you are a biological robot" meme that gets jammed down your throat, the number one barrier is, wow, there's so many smart people out there that go along with that idea. How can all these really smart people be wrong? So in that sense, I think exposing how an Oxford philosopher and an NYU professor of psychology and a well-known author and blogger who really seems to have his stuff together when he debates Christians can stumble so miserably over basic fundamental questions that we address every week on Skeptiko. Questions of consciousness, questions of how do we resolve the overwhelming evidence that suggests that consciousness isn't solely a function of the brain. I mean, that data is there, and we talk about that data a lot, but the big gap is, why doesn't that data penetrate? Why doesn't it make a difference? And that really requires studying the people that you would expect to be in a position to know better, who for whatever reason have not allowed that data to penetrate their worldview. Oh, and one more thing to add to this introduction before I let it go out the door. And by the way, there's quite a bit I have to say at the conclusion of this interview, so do stick around for that. But before we get there, one more thing to add, because you've heard this charge so many times, sandbagging, blindsided, all that stuff that these guys say over and over and over again whenever they lose. So I almost forgot to, but I managed to go back and look at the original email that I sent to John Loftus when I invited him on Skeptiko. I have to read this for you because here is a guy who's blindsided. Let's see how I invited him on the show. Hi, John. I'd like to know if you'd be available for an interview to discuss your blog and recent book, The Outsider Test for Faith. While I've enjoyed many of your withering attacks on goofy Christian apologetics, I'm always left wondering whether the science of human consciousness has been brought to the table. Do people have genuine spiritual experiences? ? Is our mind purely a function of our brain? ? Are these topics / questions you've examined, and would you be open to discussing them on Skeptiko? ? Followed by my usual boilerplate about Skeptiko and some of our previous guests. Blindsided indeed. Okay, thanks for bearing through this long introduction. Here's my dialogue with John Loftus. Today we welcome John W. Loftus to Skeptiko. John has an interesting background, having earned advanced degrees in theology and philosophy at Lincoln Seminary and again at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where he studied under none other than Dr. William Lane Craig. All of that before leaving the Christian church and becoming a popular atheist author and blogger. John is here to talk about his new book, The Outsider Test for Faith: How to Know Which Religion is True. Quite a provocative title. John, welcome to Skeptiko, and thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So can you start by telling folks what is the Outsider Test and how you came up with it?
Well, the Outsider Test for Faith is a test to determine, which religion is true, if there is one. And it asks people to test their own faith with the same standards that they use when examining other faiths. It's to test their own faith as if they were non-believers, in their own, because that's how they test the faiths that they reject. And how I came up with it was, online discussions. I run the blog Debunking Christianity, and I was told by some Christian apologists that I'm ignorant, that I really don't understand the Christian faith, because you can't understand it unless you're an insider to it. And I was a former Christian, with 3 master's degrees, one of them earned under William Lane Craig. I mean, the ignorance charge really doesn't stick with me, and yet still they were right in a sense, because at that point, having rejected my Christian faith, I was at that point an outsider. And I realized that there is a different sort of standard when you're an outsider to a faith, as I was an insider. I was indoctrinated to believe. I didn't know different, and so I accepted it. And when I accepted it, I preferred it to be true, and I argued that it was true from an insider's perspective. And it just dawned on me that the proper way to evaluate any faith, including one's own, is to do so as a non-believer. That's the only appropriate way to do so. And so then, I proposed the outsider test for faith, to examine your own faith with the same standards that you examine the other religions that you reject. And, I got a lot of backlash from it, from Christian philosophers. And this book is the culmination of a lot of thought on what it entails and to deal with the objections to it that have ensued since that time.
Well, I have to say, I thought it was great. It's one of those books where the title really captures it pretty much. You dig into it and you go, wow, that makes a lot of intuitive sense. And I have to tell you, I have a little experience with the outsider test for faith because I was preparing for this show and I got an email from a listener, and it was one of those emails we like to get. It was a guy, I'll call him Andy, and he was like, hey, man, I like the show. I like how you square off against this scientific materialism. And then he started telling me that I was a little bit off on my kind of anti-Christian rhetoric, and then he laid into me with a lot of scripture. I don't usually read emails that have a lot of scripture. I usually kind of slide past those. But I said, hey, here's an opportunity. I told him that I'm going to be interviewing you. I said, here's this guy, outsider test for faith. Andy, why don't you take the outsider test through an email exchange? And he did. So let me ask you, since you've been through this over and over and over again, how do you think that went? And then I'll tell you how it went.
Well, usually they initially reject it. Usually Christians will hear of it and reject it outright as skewed. Probably because it's proposed by an atheist, and they figure any test for faith that's proposed by an atheist, it's got to be skewed, it's got to be wrong. So initially, my guess is he objected to it, and maybe in the process of discussing that with him, he may have come to realize, well, it's not so bad after all, and then. He might claim, well, my faith passes the test after all. Am I wrong?
Well, the last part is definitely where we wound up. I'll give you a quick recap. The first round was more scripture. And I said, hey, Andy, we can't really play that game. I mean, you can't use scripture to validate scripture. I mean, you kind of get in this circular thing. But he rallied. He came around to that. And in the second round, he came along with, I think, the apologist line of defense, which is, it's not as bad as it seems. Okay, maybe we have some problems. Maybe we're not perfect, but it's not as bad as it seems. Here's some rebuttals to Bart Ehrman and the rest. To which I said, yeah, but that's not really the outsider test. The outsider test would be, why not Mormonism? Why not Joseph Smith? Which he got in the spirit of it, but it kind of came back to, yeah, well, if I really do it, then my religion really is best. Let me show you why Jesus is better than everybody else, kind of thing. So I don't know. How do you get through with the outsider test for faith?
Well, it's difficult with the mind of a believer because most of them were never argued into their faith in the first place. So it's unlikely we can argue them out of it.
I have to say, that's one point that Andy made that I do give him credit for at the end. And I appreciate, it's straight up guy. He really got into it and exchanged this with me, and I appreciate that. But his point at the end, he said, one point I'd like to ask Loftus is, what's an outsider? None of us are outsiders. We all come to the game with some baggage. And what would be your response to that?
Well, we know what it's like to be an outsider of other religious faiths, and so I don't see a problem with singling out our religious faith from the other cultural beliefs that we might have, and examining that one piece of our worldview at a time. I think that Christians misunderstand the difference between, a religion and a worldview. What they think is the case is that what they believe is part of their total worldview, such that we can't extricate one's religious faith from that worldview without subjecting our whole worldview, to the test. And, quite frankly, we can't really do that. I mean, we can't question everything that we believe at the same time. We do have a multifaceted number of beliefs and conclusions that we've arrived at that, it's just impossible, psychologically speaking, to question them all at the same time. But we know what it's like to question our political beliefs. We know what it's like to, question our ethical beliefs. We know what it's like to, question anything. Someone says that they levitated, and we know how to single that, out for scrutiny. So they misunderstand that one's religious belief is not equivalent to one's whole worldview. And to get that point across, what we do is we just simply, talk about the kinds of things that we maintain, even though we reject our faith. Now, we can ask ex-believers that question. And, for instance, I didn't reject my language. I still speak, English. I didn't reject, love. I didn't reject, how I negotiate the price of a car. I didn't reject the loving of my family. There's a host of things that I have maintained throughout my, my skeptical quest, because, I'm a living testament that you can subject your religious faith to a separate inquiry. And still maintain everything else that you believe. Now, a lot of things have fallen by the wayside, but there's a lot of things that I still have maintained throughout that quest. So it's like a boat analogy, and I write about this in my book. We can replace one plank in our boat at a time. Now, one's religious faith is definitely a big plank. But, when we're at sea, if one plank of our boat is leaky, and we can replace it and without, replacing the whole boat.
Hey, I love that analogy. I just wonder how that really holds up in this kind of culture war battle that we're in. I love the approach that you take in terms of separating those worldviews from your religious views. But I wonder if that's how the game is really played. It's like when I hear some of these debates between atheists and Christians, I'm like, wow, that's really kind of missing the point, because most Christians are not all that Christian, and most atheists are not all that atheistic in the way that you're saying. But on the other hand, when I read your site, Debunking Christianity, and you chronicle and document how deeply woven some of these religious beliefs are into our culture, into our society, I go, maybe we have to replace it more than one plank at a time. And I wonder if that's where you're going. Can we really say philosophically, like you're saying, well, I'm just going to kind of carve this religious piece out, but I'm going to go forward with the other claims that Christians make about the worldview? Don't we have to step back and say, well, what about the atheist claims for my worldview? Let me ask you, do you believe that modern atheism makes any claims about worldview kind of issues? Because I think they do.
I think that the best answer is no. The best answer is that atheism is non-belief. I mean, the word atheism means atheism, that is non-theism, and by extension, non-believer. We don't believe, just like we don't believe that, some guy levitated, who claims that he did. We basically say, show me the evidence. But basically, an atheist is someone who says, I don't think there is enough evidence to believe this. Now, what is the this? Well, it's virgin births, it's resurrections from the dead, it's asses that talk, it's donkeys that talk, snakes that walk. We don't believe that. It's those kind of things, levitating Buddhists, etc. And so, that doesn't mean that we aren't indoctrinated within our own culture to believe a host of things as well. It's just that those are the kinds of things that we don't believe. Now, I do think that once one becomes an atheist, then they do see the world a bit differently. So, that's true as well. But that's a gradual process. I mean, I have to face the fact that this is the only life I will ever live. That can be a life-changing thing for me, and that I will never see my dad, who died in '88, again. Those kind of things, and then I have to decide on my own how to live my life, apart from a divine authority. There are a lot of things that go with that. I no longer have the answers, to questions from divine authority. So there's a lot that goes with the rejection of one's religion. Okay, I'll grant you that, and there's a lot that an atheist will, usually conclude, as an atheist. I'll grant that too, like you said. I'll grant that. But I just think I see no reason to suppose that we can't subject, one of our culturally indoctrinated beliefs to a test. Now, I would have to guess that the religious belief that one has is probably, the biggest plank in the boat. I'll have to grant that. And I also have to grant that once one becomes an atheist, then he or she will reject the morality that they think is found in the Bible, whatever that is. But they can decide to love on their own. They can decide to care for people on their own.
That's the problem, I guess. And I didn't know you were going to go quite that far with what your beliefs are, because I think some of those beliefs are tricky. I mean, they would have to be subjected to the same kind of scientific criteria that we would subject anything to. That's maybe another discussion. But I will, when you say you're still open to love, you're still open to some kind of morals, but they're morals of choice. I mean, people who listen to this show might get tired of this because we just hashed this out at length on the forum, but I'd suggest you're a philosopher, that's logically inconsistent. I mean, if life has no meaning, there is no good and bad, then if consciousness, as Daniel Dennett says, is an illusion, then it's all an illusion, right? Love is an illusion, everything is an illusion, good or bad is an illusion. I don't know how we can really pick and choose those planks the way that you're kind of talking about. Isn't it kind of an all or nothing proposition?
Well, no, it's not. I'm not exactly aware of your previous, podcasts to know, where you land on these sorts of issues. It is tricky. I mean, it is tricky. I don't, for instance, think that we can come to our conclusions very easily, very readily. Maybe we don't have free will, like Daniel Dennett says. Maybe consciousness is an illusion. Maybe we live in a matrix too. Maybe there isn't a material world. These are the kinds of questions that philosophers ask. But even if we were to live in an illusion, let's say the matrix, if I may, that doesn't make any difference because we still have to live in the illusion. I mean, we still have to make choices in the illusion.
Why? Why would we perpetuate that at all? I mean, it gets to the really deep philosophical question of why choose life at all? I mean, it's all an illusion. There's nothing. You're not doing anything. Nothing is happening. You're not moving towards anything. Your parents don't matter. Your children don't matter. Nothing matters. I mean, that is the logic.
Come on. Are you playing the devil's advocate with me? Because I find that ludicrous. I find it ludicrous to say that nothing matters. I mean, really.
I do too, but that's at the core of this. How then? What matters then? How do we decide what matters?
It doesn't matter now, in August of 2013, what I do in life. A million years from now. I mean, a million years from now, nothing I have ever done matters. It doesn't matter. So ultimately, nothing matters. But it does matter to the people I love and the people who love me, my friends. I mean, so I find that ludicrous to say nothing
John,
matters.
There's no such thing as love. Love is an illusion. Love is an illusion. It's this chemical reaction you have in your brain that you're programmed to do. You're scoffing, but I scoff too. I think the whole idea that we don't have free will is ludicrous. I think the idea that love isn't real is ludicrous. But I think in that same way, I think we never examine fully those claims that are being made by atheists. We wind up talking about codices and empty tombs and other crazy stuff, but we never talk about what's at the core of this idea that you are, as Richard Dawkins says, a biological robot. And I think that is at the core of this debate, because Christians aren't all that Christian, and atheists aren't all that atheistic. What people say is, you guys say nothing, and I say something. You guys say biological robot, and I say, I ain't no biological robot, and you want to talk about free will? Hell yes, I have free will. Of course I have free will. It's obvious I have free will. From your philosophical background, isn't there a philosophical gap there? Aren't you kind of trying to play some middle ground there that doesn't really exist when you want to say, I'm still about love, I'm still about caring for the people I care about? How is that really consistent with this biological robot meme that Richard Dawkins gives us?
Well, let's put it to you this way. Let's grant with many philosophers, materialists, that we don't have free will. Just grant it for a minute. I know that you find that ludicrous, but let's just grant we don't have free will.
Well, I think you find it ludicrous too, by the way, but go ahead.
I'm sorry?
I suspect that you find it ludicrous. You don't live your life like you don't have free will. Of course, you live your life every day, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, right. And so I make choices, and these choices affect people, and the people that matter to me. And so I can't do any other. And I do make choices, and that's all there is to it. I don't find that the idea that let me just say it this way. My specialty isn't in discussions about free will. I mean, I have to stick to things that I have a specialty in. But there are some brighter minds than I who have looked at the issue, naturalists, atheists, materialists, and they've concluded we don't have free will. I find their arguments pretty persuasive, actually. But that doesn't change a thing. It's like living in a matrix. It doesn't change a thing. Let's say we are. Let's say everything's an illusion. Let's say we have no free will. It doesn't change a thing. We still have to act, and we still have to make choices, and we still have to decide based on the evidence, what we will believe. Now you say, well, all that is, not free inside you. Let's grant that. What that does is it destroys Christianity as well, and that's my point. If we have no free will, it destroys Christianity as well, because the free will unto salvation, choice to believe in Jesus is gone. There's no hell. There's no rational basis to believe in God either. So, but they still have to make the choices they do based on the evidence that they think is the case. And even though we're both potentially in the matrix, even though we're both without free will, we still have these arguments, and they still change minds. There are no
minds. There are no minds. We are biological robots. I mean,
brains.
Look. Okay.
Brains.
Well,
brains.
we can't change brains. They're robotic. They just act according to their preconceived. This is ludicrous. Look, I understand where you're coming from. You're focusing on Christianity and debunking Christianity, and there's a lot to be done there. But I think you've kind of made my case to a certain extent. This logically falls apart. And moreover, like I always tell people is, your philosophy isn't as complicated as it seems. It's how you live your life, And point to me the person who lives their life like love isn't real, like connection with people isn't real.
Sure.
It's just, it's silliness, it's absurdity in the same way that some of this other stuff in terms of biblical inerrancy gets into the absurd really quickly when you follow it. But I do think where that leads us then is to maybe re-examine some of those assumptions that are underlying atheism, underlying this idea that, we are these biological robots. But maybe that isn't something you've really gone into very far.
Well, I'll make an argument that if that's the case, if that's the case, then there's no other way around living our lives like we do and making the arguments that we do.
But hold on, you can cut that short and just say there's no reason to really live your life. Your life is an absurdity. It makes no sense. When you get to the point of realizing that this is true to that extent, there's really the famous philosopher Albert Camus said this, there's only one philosophical question: suicide. If you really believe that life is that meaningless, there's no need to continue the meaninglessness. There's no need for future generations or past generations or evolution. It's all meaningless. There's no reason to go on. That's the logical extension here. And of course it's absurd, but it's the absurdity of the atheist position, I should say.
Yeah. Well, I think it's absurd to end your life. I think we have the will to survive, and that's all there is to it. And to live one's life based on a delusion that there's a God who's going to reward you into heaven, I think that's even more absurd. I think that we can do more, we can do better. This is the only life we've been given. I think that this universe is quite remarkable for life, and let's extend it as long as we can. Let's not have that nuclear warfare that might ensue if believers get their hands on the trigger. And I do that for my posterity. I do that for my kids. I do that for future generations. Let's extend this. Let's see how long we can live on Earth. Let's see what we can accomplish. Now I'll never see it, but that's not absurd to want that. Given the fact that this is quite a remarkable experiment. You might think that that's absurd, but like I said, it's more absurd. I mean, it's absurd to the core to live one's life on a delusion. I mean, accept the fact, whatever the facts are. There's no reason why anyone should reject a conclusion if the evidence points to that conclusion, just because they don't like the conclusion. And I find a lot of Christians do that. They simply, we reject the outsider test for faith, or we reject atheism's conclusion that all we are is biology in motion. They reject that because they don't like the conclusion, and the conclusion is, maybe we don't have free will, and maybe our life isn't going to be meaningful for in a million years. That's rejecting the evidence for a conclusion based on the conclusion. Bite the bullet. If the evidence is there, bite the bullet. I'm sorry. You have to live life. We are thrust into this life, Camus also said, and or was it Sartre? We're thrust into this life. We didn't ask to be here, and so make the best of it. And that's what we're doing.
Okay, let's get off the philosophy, because I think we've maybe ridden that horse as far as we can. And I appreciate you going in and digging into these things. I understand that the main thrust of your work is this idea of debunking Christianity. You do a nice job on your blog of really, as I mentioned earlier, bringing up all the cultural issues that surround Christianity and Christianity's movement forward. I think there's a lot of sense among intellectual people and academic people that, hey, that's really not so much of an issue in our society anymore, and there's this waning of Christianity. But I think what you do on your website is point out that that's not really always the case, and there is still this strong cultural movement towards this very bracketed kind of view of the world that comes from Christian dogma.
That's my focus. Yeah, that's my focus. It's my niche. It's basically a destructive kind of a game. I don't want to use the word game so much. Strategy. Strategy would work. My focus is on destroying ideas. It's debunking. It's saying this is wrong and I doubt it and there's no evidence for it. I don't necessarily focus on constructing a metaphysical, a naturalist worldview. Others do that much better than I do, and I learn from them. But I have a single-minded purpose to debunk the influence of Christianity in the society and in the world. And there are many reasons for it, and that's because I think faith ultimately causes harm to the people of faith and others as they are involved in society. And so if I can get rid of that influence, or if I can minimize it in even a small way for future generations, I think that that's a good thing. I think that people need to think for themselves rather than mindlessly quote from the Bible or the theology based on it. I've seen too much in my life that leads me to think people would be better off without it.
Well, I think we're probably in sync there. I think I'm kind of an iconoclast and a destroyer as well, but I guess I've set my sights a little bit differently, because the last topic I guess I'd bring up, you talked about a lot of evidence there and that you are evidence-based. What I've really focused on is, one, falsifying this biological robot, this mind equals brain idea. It's falsified all over the place. I mean, I got dozens of very well-qualified, highly respected researchers who suggest that that's not the case. One of the main topics we talk about in the show a lot is near-death experience research, science, published papers. A lot of people don't know that there's over 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers on near-death experience. I'm wondering, have you looked at near-death experience science at all? Have you dealt with it either on your blog? I know it's not in your book because I look there. Any thoughts on that?
Well, Victor Stenger wrote a chapter where, in my anthology, The End of Christianity, where he looked at Dinesh D'Souza's claims of those sorts of things.
Hold on. One, Victor Stenger's been on the show. I don't think he fared very well. I don't think his chapter on near-death experience holds up. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But Dinesh D'Souza is not a near-death experience researcher. He's a Christian apologist. So one of the things I think a lot of atheist folks don't understand is I'm not talking about people that have an axe to grind. I'm talking about people at university who are publishing in peer-reviewed journals. These are not people who have a preconceived idea or a thing that they're driving for. They're saying, this is a medical mystery. The doctor says, hey, this guy got up off the table after being resuscitated and said, this is what I saw. That's a medical mystery. I need to investigate. Anyone would be curious about investigating it. So they have, and this is what they've found out. That's evidence I think we have to just confront and deal with one way or another.
Oh, I agree. All I can do is point you to the experts. Again, that's not my focus. Keith Augustine and Michael Martin, the atheist philosopher, and Keith Augustine is, I think, the executive director of secular, infidels.com, what have you. They've done a lot of research on those sorts of things, and I think you can
haven't, but that's okay. That's okay. No, it's not your thing. I get it. I mean, but those people haven't done anything.
Well, you know what? I'm going to just tell you. I mean, I have a predisposition against those sorts of things because I have no clue what the difference is between a mind and a brain is. I don't know where the mind is located. I don't know how the mind works. I know you can have brain damage and all of a sudden it affects the mind. Now, to explain that, I know there's a lot of things, that can happen: a stroke, a seizure, Alzheimer's. Why is the mind affected by those things? It seems like if you just started whittling away with the brain, you'd have no mind left. Now that seems to be a supervening type of evidence over to these experiential claims. And I don't know. I haven't done those sorts of researches, but I know that there's a lot of things that neurology is now discovering about the brain that explains any phenomena that we might want to explain. Now, I just find that sort of argument, philosophical, evidential as it is, to be supervening until I can see some clear evidence that ghosts exist. And I don't even understand how ghosts can walk through walls. These movies. these movies that depict ghosts, why are they standing on the ground? Why don't they just fall into the middle of the earth? I mean, why aren't they just floating in the air? I mean, these sorts of things, they're just, I have a predisposition to call them all loony, before looking at them. Now, I know you disagree. That's fine. Disagree. But until you can explain why neurology is explaining more and more about why we think and how we learn to think and what regions of the brain we think with and how to, do brain surgery and use drugs to cure the mind, then I don't assent to the proposition that there's a mind in the first place. I don't know any invisible entity that can exist outside of a physical body in the first place. So where's it exist? Is this my toe? Is this in my knee? Why is it located up here? Why do you think the mind is here, not in my nose? Or why is it not my whole body? And if it's my whole body, well, then why not identify it with my body? I find it interesting you wanted to interview me on the outsider test for faith, and you have a pet peeve, free will. I mean, if you wanted to interview someone about free will, if you wanted to interview someone about near-death experiences, well, then why don't you contact someone who wants to, talk about that, who's done some research on it?
I have. I got 200 shows. You got it. I mean,
like you want to try to blindside me with a false pretense of talking about something I know about, and you want to talk about things that I haven't commented on yet. Watch out, I can.
I don't get that. I hear that sometimes. John, you can ask me anything in this field. You can ask me about Christianity. You can ask me about anything.
Your views intrigue me, I have to say.
Well, okay, but I don't understand why. I told you how I came at this, right? And I did the outsider test for faith. My point is really that this discussion is stuck in stupid. The atheist versus Christian debate is stuck on stupid, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of empty tombs and codices and all this nonsense that doesn't get us to the real issue that we talked about of what are the claims of atheism. If they stand up, if they're the right claims, then I'm on board. I want to know what the truth is. So if you can defend those claims, then go ahead and do it. But I'm with you. Let me just say, I'm with you. I'm with you on the outsider test for faith. I'm with you on debunking Christianity. I'm saying, dude, turn the page and let's get on to the real discussion. I don't know why you'd find that so offensive.
I didn't say I was offended. I just said that, you want to talk about other things, and that's okay. I mean, let's go with it. I mean, I think that you think you basically you're telling me, okay, now move on. Christianity's been debunked. Now let's move on.
Kinda. Yeah, I am saying that.
That's fine. That's fine. I mean, I understand the criticism. I'm not moving on though, and the reason why is because there are still a majority of people out there who are Christians. I just went to the Creation Museum in Kentucky a couple of days ago. I wrote about it on my blog. It would be August 8th, on my blog.
I saw it there.
Okay, and it's just ludicrous. I mean, you should see the number of people lined up for that, and the money that it takes to build that, and they're building a second part to it where they're going to have a life-size Noah's Ark, and there are people paying $29, a hit to go through that. And these people
Free
vote.
will.
These people write letters to their senators, and they're a danger to society. I mean, and all I can do is argue them out of it, and I'm going to continue doing that because that's my expertise. Now, others, I can't know everything. I mean, you got to admit that. I mean, with yourself, no one can know everything. So I'm going to focus because I think that's where my particular expertise is, and I'm going to continue doing so.
I think that's good. As I mentioned before, I think there's a lot of work to still be done there, and I think when we move past that and say, "Oh, wow, that's handled. We're way past that." It's not true, and I think you point that out. But I do think as you were scrambling around there trying to do your mind equals brain thing, I understand the scramble. That's fair, but it doesn't hold up. Okay, mind equals brain doesn't hold up. The near-death experience science is solid. Vic Stenger, go listen to the interview. He's quoting the wrong people, just like you are. These are not people who've published in peer-reviewed journals.
Just for your listeners, I mean, your listeners would know your views more than my listeners would know your views. You don't accept Christianity. What do you accept? Just state briefly for my listeners, own understanding.
Well, I always think that's a funny question because it kind of gets to the problem. It's like, okay, if you're not Christian, what are you? In terms
I'm
of
just asking.
That's
a factual
funny.
question.
No, that's fine. But I think it's part of the problem. It's like it's the problem really that you deal with is that's how we think of things. We think of things in such a religious framework that if someone doesn't immediately sign up with one or the other, we don't know quite how to peg him. All I can say is that when we falsify the idea that you are this biological robot, and we accept that that's absurd. Of course I have free will. I do what I can. Want me to raise my hand? I raise my hand. Free will. I did it. There, I just proved the test. Once we get past that, and once we get past the idea that consciousness ends at death, which is, again, like you said before, only I don't think you want to accept it, but that's where the evidence points. It just points that way. I don't know what that means, John, but as you said with the planks thing, the planks in the boat. When I cross that chasm and I say, okay, that's the evidence and I have to deal with it, a lot of things start falling differently in terms of how I orient myself to the world, how I orient myself to other people, how I orient myself to morals, purpose, meaning in life. So that is what I'm exploring. But I'm exploring it from the other side of the chasm, if you will.
Other side of the chasm.
Being consciousness survives death. Let's put that as the you are not a biological robot.
Well, okay, all right, fine. I mean, I disagree, and I've said why. So,
that's always, of course, you disagree. You stand up and say, "I am a biological robot. I am gonna stand by that."
Well, there's no evidence for invisible beings or entities.
Hey, but you, as you live your life like a biological robot.
Everybody does. That's all there is.
Okay. Well,
you have to look into the philosophical quandaries with trying to distinguish between mind and body. I mean, I taught the introduction philosophy classes that you would probably be interested in looking at how they have tried to relate the mind and the body, and they just really can't do it. I mean, it's really ludicrous to see how they do that, and you need to look at the mind body problem. I mean, look at it reasonably philosophically. I know that you say, well, we have evidence for life after death, but there's contrary studies. I mentioned a couple of, Michael Martin's doing and Keith Augustine, and you don't like Victor Stenger's views. Okay, fine, but there are certainly contrary evidence and arguments.
No, that's cool. Hey, I just talked to Stephen Law. A couple weeks ago, atheist philosopher at University of London, PhD in philosophy from Oxford or Cambridge. I'm sorry, which one I got wrong. But
and you probably blindsided him too.
Dude, I get this all the time. Blindsided. How are you blindsided? How are you blindsided? Why can't you talk about this? Why wouldn't you be equipped to talk about this? I'll tell you what it is. The fact that you feel blindsided says you haven't looked into this enough, because these are core questions. So you're going around like a gadfly, like Socrates, and trying to ask people about questions that they haven't studied up on too well yet. All right, then fine. I mean, do that. You're trying to get atheists to look at the evidence that you consider to be there, even though you reject Christianity, and that's fine. But I'm not the one to ask on those things. I mean, I said what my focus is, and I think that the conclusions that there is a mind, just don't hold up. I mean, not at all. And from what I've studied, now you say, well, why have you studied this? Well, I don't write a lot about politics either. I mean, have you? What if you blindsided me by asking me about gun control in America? I mean, well, I have some ideas on it, and I can point you to some writings about it. What if you asked me about immigration reform? What if you asked me about Obamacare? I mean, you could do that if you want, but you're asking the wrong person. I would have to say, well, you ought to talk to this expert. You got to talk to that expert. I mean, we can't know everything. I mean, it's ludicrous for you to think that I'm supposed to know everything. John, what do you feel most blindsided by in this interview?
Well, I believe you would ask me to talk about the outsider test for faith, and we're not.
Well, but what in particular did we talk about that you felt most blindsided?
Well, I tell you what, Alex. If you don't have anything else more to say than what you've said, then let's call us a day. Now, don't conclude by that I'm giving up. Don't conclude by that Loftus couldn't answer my questions. That'd be ludicrous as well. I'm just saying, you want to talk about the topic or not? I mean, and I gather you don't, and that's okay. Let's just call it a day. I've got other things to do.
I hear you, and I appreciate the hour, and I appreciate your work and the book.
Thank you so much.
I wish you would just tackle that last question. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. But what did you feel you were most blindsided by?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll let the listeners decide for themselves on this. But I don't want to discount your questions. I don't want to. I think that you might be doing a service to atheists by raising these questions. And so continue that. I encourage the exploration of all the ideas. Let's say that we do have free will. Let's say that there is an afterlife. Let's say that sounds sort of like a deist position to me. Now, a deist, I'm not trying to put a label on you.
Not necessarily, but go ahead, keep going.
Okay, all right, fine. And the deist position is, I think, the only other reasonable position to take. I mean, I think that it is within the realm of reason. In fact, deism started as a movement in England, I think in the 1600s or 1700s, where they wanted to evaluate everything based on reason, reason and evidence. And, deism quickly degenerated into atheism, but there are still deists, around. And, Dawkins, I think Christopher Hitchens said that the only kind of God or religion they might accept would be deism as a mere possibility. So that's fine. That's fine. And pursue if that's what you are, pursue those kinds of questions. And but support me in my work, and I think you do. Support me in my work as I attack these the fundamentalist Christians, because you and I are in agreement on this. You're not my enemy. You are my friend as you tackle those issues as well.
Okay. Thanks again. The book is The Outsider Test for Faith,
which we didn't talk about much.
You know what? If for the folks who are going to tune out after the first 10 minutes, I think they heard a lot about it. And you can find out a lot about the Outsider Test. There's a lot of good material out there. There's on John's blog, debunkingchristianity.blogspot.com. He talks about it, and there's many reviews on there. There's tons of reviews on Amazon. It's a very popular book, well received. The Outsider Test for Faith, How to Know Which Religion is True. John W. Loftus, thanks for joining me on this is one of the toughest Skeptiko interviews I've ever had, man. I hope the rest of your day goes better than this hour.
I'm doing fine. Thank you. All right, bye.
Thanks again to John for joining me today on Skeptiko. As is becoming more and more my custom here on Skeptiko, I did have quite an interesting follow-up email exchange with John, and I really can't resist sharing it with you. Here goes. Here's my email to John a day or two after the podcast. Hi, John. Was thinking about our interview yesterday and how you felt blindsided. Now, I'm not sure how a guy with a master's degree in philosophy who's written 3 books on atheism could be blindsided by basic questions about the philosophy of atheism, but if that's how you felt, then maybe we can fix it. Why don't you come back on Skeptiko for a redo? You'll have the advantage of knowing everything I'm going to ask, and you'll have plenty of time to prepare your counter-arguments. John, I know these kind of dialogues can be a bit uncomfortable, but like you say in your book, we have to be willing to look at our beliefs as an outsider if we're ever going to nudge closer to the truth. Alex. John's response, and in order to kind of shorten up this podcast here, I'm going to thread in his response with my response back to him, which is the last we hear from him. We never hear from him after this, even though I ask for him to respond, and you'll hear what I asked for him to do, but there's no response from John after this. So here's John's email to me with my response. John writes, "Your God can safely be ignored as irrelevant and unnecessary, a hypothesis we don't have any need for, even if he or she exists. I mean, why bother with the passion you seem to have for the deist God or the God of the philosophers? Why would anyone care as much as you do about such a God that is a mere curiosity? I reply, where are you getting this from? I didn't even mention God in our interview. John continues, you know nothing about him or her, God that is. You believe she exists in an afterlife. Big deal. You should adopt a protest theology like others have done and protest her existence even if she exists. She clearly has left nebulous evidence that she exists. Why does she need you to make her case for her? What difference does it make to it that it exists? I reply, again, I think you've kind of missed the thrust of our discussion. So let me recap the 3 main points. Number 1, atheists, even popular, media-savvy ones like you who write books and give public presentations, often make claims. Example, we are biological robots. Life is meaningless. Consciousness is an illusion. Without realizing the implications. You demonstrated this in our interview when you seemed genuinely confused when I pointed out that your love for family can be nothing more than a meaningless illusion, according to your belief system. Number 2, most atheists live their lives in a way that is inconsistent with their stated beliefs. I think you do care about your family. I think you do act as if your choices matter. I think you do think you are doing good in the world by countering the negative impact of fundamentalist religions. But during our interview, you seem to be unable to resolve the absurdity of your bite the bullet, we're all just biological robots with the life you live. Number 3, new atheists are in a stuck-on stupid debate with fundamentalist Christians when the real action is whether or not consciousness is an illusion. If consciousness is more than an epiphenomena of the brain, as the data suggest, and if consciousness survives bodily death, as the data suggests, then we have to take seriously questions about the order and meaning of consciousness. You don't have to be an expert in consciousness science to see that this leaves little room for your new brand of atheism. Now back to John's email. If we survive death, then we do. It changes nothing. I reply, you're kind of making my points for me. If we survive death, then we are not an illusion. We are not biological robots. This changes everything for the new atheist crowd, as well as for the materialistic science crowd in general. Back to John's email. We should still be good to people. We should still investigate the world through science. Let science do its work. My reply, why? I'm surprised you keep stumbling over this. This is Atheism 101. First off, how are you defining good in your meaningless world/universe? And second, why should we anything? John, no, I must devote my time to more important things. I cannot accept anything based on faith, and that is all you have, despite any protestations from you. Solve the brain-mind problem first. Look into neurology. There is your answer. Then simply bite the bullet. Since evolution is the case, then humans go where all animals go when we die. We all rot in the ground. Period. If instead all animals live forever, then it wouldn't be anything special for all of us to go there. That existence would be just another world like ours. Who cares if you're correct, except as a mere curiosity? I'm all for being curious. We need to be curious, but I intend to change the religious landscape. That's my focus. My response. Wow, I'm really having a hard time following your logic. When you say solve the brain-mind problem, it makes me think that you understand that consciousness is the fundamental question to all this. But then you slip into this bite the bullet, we're all just biological robot stuff. I agree. Let's not base our beliefs on faith. Let's examine the data. Shall we start with the near-death experience science? And I provided him 2 links, one to my interview with Jeff Long, and then one to my follow-up interview with Jeff Long, takes on the critics of the afterlife. Back to John's email. If you would like to interview someone on the issue of free will, I highly recommend Jonathan Pierce, author of the book Free Will, an investigation into whether we have free will or whether I was always going to write this book. My response? Sure, happy to. Please pass along my invitation and I'll wait for him to contact me. In order to avoid blindsiding, you may want to suggest the following to Jonathan. And I provided 2 links. Episode 184, Rupert Sheldrake Sets Science Free from Dogma, and the other from my interview with Dr. Mario Beauregard. By the way, of course, I have yet to hear from Jonathan Pierce, and I doubt I ever will, but the invitation's there. Love to have him on. Back to John's email. If you want to interview someone about life after death, then find Keith Augustine at Internet Infidels. My response? Again, I'd be happy to. I've invited him 3 times, but he never seems to have the time. Please pass along my invitation and I'll await his reply. I then mentioned that I have interviewed many prominent NDE skeptics, including Dr. Victor Stenger and Dr. Susan Blackmore. Again, I have yet to hear from Keith Augustine, but Keith, if you're out there, love to have you on Skeptiko to talk about near-death experience science. Finally, wrapping up John's email, he writes, if you want to interview someone about brain-mind problem, then contact either Paul or Patricia Churchland. I've tried. If you want to interview a neuroscientist on the same issue, then contact David Eagleman. Already did. Send him the link. Then, as his final word on whether or not he'd like to come on for a redo, I thought a very fair, generous offer. Someone who feels blindsided. I was willing to trash this initial interview and do a total redo, but John's response was a no. Now, I don't feel a need to do a lot more interviews with these hardcore atheists, or even the atheists who are hardcore but don't appear hardcore, like Gary Marcus and Dr. Stephen Law. But again, as I said in the opening, I think it's crucial that we expose how intellectually feeble these arguments are, and we contrast that with the way that this silliness is propped up in the mainstream science media. Okay, I have one question to tee up from this debate, and it was the one question I was hoping to get to with John, but wasn't able to because, well, you see how the interview went. And that is, to what extent does this stuck-on stupid debate between Christian apologists and atheists prevent science from making progress on the most fundamental issues of life? Who are we? Where did we come from? Where do we go? Big picture questions. To what extent is the debate holding us back? Of course, the place to respond to that question or formulate a question of your own is through the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com, where you can leave a comment right there in the comment section or click on over to the forum and join the discussion there. We'll have a number of interesting shows coming up, quite a few in the hopper. I don't know which one I'm going to put out next, but you'll just have to wait and see, I guess. Until next time, do take care, and bye for now. So I felt obligated, and I felt like there was enough of a difference between the two that I could pursue both of them, because they really cover 2 different aspects of the atheism proposition. One is the philosophy of science proposition that you heard from Dr. Stephen Law that I think doesn't hold up very well, and from the discussion we've had, he doesn't really come off as sounding like he has a very strong case, but we'll kind of leave that as it is. And then the second is this religious thrust that you get from John Loftus, whose website is all about debunking Christianity, but as you'll hear in this dialogue, seems to come up short and actually sound somewhat convoluted once you get past some of these silly, empty tomb Christianity kind of debate. And let me add one more thing that I've said in the past, but I think bears repeating. These kind of interviews are among the most important kind of interviews I can do, that I can bring forward. Because I believe the number one thing that holds people back from making their own personal paradigm shift, beyond the silliness of this "you are a biological robot" meme that gets jammed down your throat, the number one barrier is, wow, there's so many smart people out there that go along with that idea. How can all these really smart people be wrong? So in that sense, I think exposing how an Oxford philosopher and an NYU professor of psychology and a well-known author and blogger who really seems to have his stuff together when he debates Christians can stumble so miserably over basic fundamental questions that we address every.
On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex talks with author and well-known atheist John Loftus about his book, The Outsider Test for Faith: How to Know Which Religion is True.
When we falsify the idea that you are this biological robot, and we accept that that's absurd. And once we get past the idea that consciousness ends at death, when I cross that chasm and I say, okay, that's the evidence and I have to deal with it, a lot of things start falling differently in terms of how I orient myself to morals, purpose, meaning in life. You are not a biological robot.
Well, okay. All right, fine. I mean, I disagree. I've said why. So,
of course, you disagree. You stand up and say, I am a biological robot. I am going to stand by that.
Well, there's no evidence for invisible beings or entities.
Hey, but you, as you live your life like a biological robot.
Everybody does. That's all there is.
Okay.
I don't want to discount your questions. I don't want to. I think that you might be doing a service to atheists. I encourage the exploration of all the ideas.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and this episode of Skeptiko is yet another in this series I've been doing every week on Skeptiko. Questions of consciousness, questions of how do we resolve the overwhelming evidence that suggests that consciousness isn't solely a function of the brain. I mean, that data is there, and we talk about that data a lot, but the big gap is, why doesn't that data penetrate? Why doesn't it make a difference? And that really requires studying the people that you would expect to be in a position to know better, who for whatever reason have not allowed that data to penetrate their worldview. Oh, and one more thing to add to this introduction before I let it go out the door. And by the way, there's quite a bit I have to say at the conclusion of this interview, so do stick around for that. But before we get there, one more thing to add, because you've heard this charge so many times, sandbagging, blindsided, all that stuff that these guys say over and over and over again whenever they lose. So I almost forgot to, but I managed to go back and look at the original email that I sent to John Loftus when I invited him on Skeptiko. I have to read this for you because here is a guy who's blindsided. Let's see how I invited him on the show. Hi, John. I'd like to know if you'd be available for an interview to discuss your blog and recent book, The Outsider Test for Faith. While I've enjoyed many of your withering attacks on goofy Christian apologetics, I'm always left wondering whether the science of human consciousness has been brought to the table. Do people have on atheism? Now, I do feel a need to tell you a little bit about how I came to do this interview, because, as you know, if you've listened, you just heard a similar kind of debate with philosophy professor Dr. Stephen Law. And actually, these two interviews with Dr. Law and John Loftus came about as the result of my interview on episode 217 with Gary Marcus. because Gary Marcus, of course, is this NYU professor of psychology, best-selling author, writes frequently on consciousness issues, yet if you listen to the interview, stumbled with some basic questions about consciousness. And surprisingly, but I guess not surprisingly for me because I keep pounding on this drum, is essentially atheistic in his thinking. That is, academia is atheistic. So you go to a guy like Gary Marcus, he's not waving the flag for atheism, but you push through just a little bit and boom, there it is. The same kind of talking points parroted back to you that you hear from atheists. So that led me to saying, I really need to revisit the atheist proposition directly and establish a dialogue with some atheists. So the way that I often do that is I go to Amazon and I look for the best-selling books in the category I'm interested in. In this case, it was atheism. And I came up with Dr. Stephen Law's book, and I also came up with John Loftus's book. So it's kind of a numbers game in inviting guests on. You don't get everyone you ask. So a lot of times I'll go out with a couple of requests and hope to get one. In this case, I got both of them. I got one, and then a week later, John Loftus responded and said, hey, I missed the email, but I'd be happy to do it. Genuine spiritual experiences? ? Is our mind purely a function of our brain? ? Are these topics / questions you've examined, and would you be open to discussing them on Skeptiko? ? Followed by my usual boilerplate about Skeptiko and some of our previous guests. Blindsided indeed. Okay, thanks for bearing through this long introduction. Here's my dialogue with John Loftus. Today we welcome John W. Loftus to Skeptiko. John has an interesting background, having earned advanced degrees in theology and philosophy at Lincoln Seminary and again at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where he studied under none other than Dr. William Lane Craig. All of that before leaving the Christian church and becoming a popular atheist author and blogger. John is here to talk about his new book, The Outsider Test for Faith: How to Know Which Religion is True. Quite a provocative title. John, welcome to Skeptiko, and thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So can you start by telling folks what is the outsider test and how you came up with it?
Well, the outsider test for faith is a test to determine, which religion is true if there is one. And it asks people to test their own faith with the same standards that they use when examining other